Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 27th meeting of 2019. Before we move to our first item on the agenda, can I remind everyone to either switch off their mobile phones or put them on silent as they affect the broadcasting system. The first item on the agenda is for the committee to decide whether it wants to take agenda item 3 and all further consideration of its approach to the Animals and Wildlife Penalties, Protections and Powers Bill in private. Are we agreed? Agreed. Thank you. We are agreed. The next item on our agenda is to hear evidence from Scottish Government officials on the proposed deposit return scheme. And I'm delighted to welcome Jenny Gardner, the head of the Circular Economy Unit, Scott Wood, the team leader for deposit return scheme, Emily Freeman, solicitor for the Scottish Government, and David Barnes, Zero Waste Scotland's Programme Manager for the Deposit Return Scheme for the Scottish Government. Good morning to you all and thank you for coming in. So we have got an hour to rattle through an enormous amount of questions. I'll try and get most of our questions from our colleagues through. So I guess in managing that, just like raise your hand for the most appropriate person to answer those questions and we'll do it quite efficiently. I would like to start us off by talking about the scope. And can I ask you to talk us through the process that went into determining which materials the government has decided to put through this scheme? Scott.
Hi, morning everyone. So we've considered quite a wide range of evidence when determining the range of materials that have to be included within the scope of the scheme. Looking at the three materials that we've chosen to include, PET, plastic, glass and metal cans, they account for in excess of 80% of the containers on the Scottish drinks market at the moment. So adopting a design with that scope of materials included is consistent with Minister's ambition to deliver a fairly broad-ranging and comprehensive scheme. We have undertaken an extensive consultation on our proposals, and indeed the three materials that we've gone for were the most popular, identified by those respondents who participated in the consultation. The final thing I would say is that these materials are actually also common features in other schemes internationally. So that gives us a degree of confidence that we can deliver a scheme in Scotland that has this scope. And by relying on or adopting a set of materials that are commonplace elsewhere, we can significantly reduce the operational and commercial risk associated with landing a scheme of this nature. So those are some of the factors that have been part of our consideration around the scope of materials that we've included in the scheme.
Because some industry representatives have got in touch with every MSP and certainly the committee around the inclusion of glass and have raised concerns about that. One of the things that those industry representatives have claimed is that it will undermine curbside collections by local authorities. Could you answer first of all why is that decision been made to include glass, first of all? And what do you say in response to that claim that local authorities may find it's not viable to be picking up the type of glass that doesn't go into DRS, like jars, for example?
So David's actually best placed, I think, to provide a bit more background on the case for including glass more generally. Just before I pass over to David, on the point around the collection of the residual glass, local authorities will continue to be under a legal obligation to collect glass which is captured through curbside because it does not fall within scope of DRS. And some of the wider changes that are planned in relation to packaging producer responsibility for other packaging other than the material that will be captured through DRS will ensure the viability of those collections going forward.
And in terms of, the sort of like the finances around that, yeah. So glass obviously has a value, and if the council's collecting good quality glass in terms of, like, say, you know, the clear glass wine bottles, for example, yeah, then that has a value. What is that going to mean for councils in terms of, I mean, is there a saving going to come from the fact that glass is going to be off our streets and glass and plastics and aluminium is going to be off our streets as a result of DRS? Is that going to be a kind of, you know...
So there's a counterbalance there. And
counterbalance that, yeah.
David can talk about the case.
Okay, I'll let David get on before I pepper you with more questions. I'm sure you're going to answer them all anyway.
I was about to say, please do continue peppering Scott with questions. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the impact on local authority curbside collection, so there is the way that we have modelled it is that there is an impact on in terms of a cost to local authorities because of the reason that you identified, that where they are selling materials and getting an income from that sale of materials, then they lose that income stream. That income stream is about £40 million across the 32 local authorities. But actually, the savings for local authorities come from 3 areas in terms of direct operational savings. One is that a lot of this material is in landfill at the moment. They're paying to dispose of it because the capture rate for glass, as an example, is only about 63%, where under a deposit return scheme, it would be about 90%. So what you're getting is this situation where local authorities are actually paying for a heavy material to go to landfill and incurring a larger cost than the income that they get if it's being separated out. The second thing that local authorities is, regardless of whether it's in the residual bin, so going to landfill, or whether it's in being collected for recycling, local authorities have operational costs in terms of the staff and vehicles to physically go and collect that material from all of their households. And then the third element of cost to local authorities is where it isn't disposed of properly and it enters the litter stream and they have to clean it up off of our streets. In terms of the savings for local authorities, it's about £230 million saving because of all of those other operational costs. And that's the reason why the full business case stage 1, which was published in May, identified a net saving for local authorities of about £191 million, was because absolutely we acknowledge that there is reduced income from those revenue streams, but it's more than offset by the fact that they physically don't have to collect all of this material using those resources, and it frees up those resources to be used for other purposes.
And there was any advantage, I mean, in the DRS system in terms of contaminated glass, you know, because obviously householders putting glass out, a lot of it sometimes might be contaminated, not washed properly. Will DRS deal with that element of contamination as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think so we talk quite rightly about the huge increase in terms of what deposit return will deliver in terms of the quantity of material for recycling. But the thing that impresses me most in terms of the schemes I've seen elsewhere is the quality of material. And what that does is that allows closed loop recycling. It allows us to realise this ambition of a circular economy, because you get the situation where glass is an example. At the moment, if it's collected at curbside, you will lose about 20% of the glass you collect for recycling through process loss, so the tipping and collecting of it through various stages, but also because well-intentioned members of the public put things like ceramic into glass, and when that then goes to facility, it isn't all sorted out. It results in contamination and results in part of the load having to be rejected as a result. Whereas with a deposit return scheme, you have this vetting process which gets really clean material in. And from a Scottish context, we have a large native glass reprocessing industry. This offers a real economic opportunity for us to maximise the quality of that and make sure that that can go into iconic manufacturing such as Scottish whisky bottles.
There were certain items and products that you discounted as being part of the DRS system. Could you maybe talk me through, for example, milk? The plastic cartons used for milk, for example. You talk through what was discounted and why?
Yeah. So our approach has been to focus on exclusion of materials rather than products. That's because the intention here is not to skew any product market. It's instead to drive up recycling rates for materials. So that's the basis for our approach. Now, we have decided to exclude HDPE plastic from the scope of the scheme. That is primarily used for fresh dairy, as you highlight there. We did hear some significant reservations raised by consultation respondents around the inclusion of HDPE, both retailers and members of the public. They had some concerns around the perceived hygiene risks associated with returning those containers to return
The
points.
HDPE was the milk.
It's the milk,
yeah.
the milk container, yeah. So, so they've raised some concerns about returning these containers into retail return points and them sitting there for a period of time. Some of the perceived hygiene risks that could be associated with that. Now, we don't actually, we don't recognise many of those risks, but clearly there is a perception there, and it's important we listen to the feedback we've received from members of the public and retailers, because it is really critical that those stakeholders engage actively in the delivery of deposit return from the outset. So we need them to trust and support the scheme that we're bringing forward. And it's on that basis that we've excluded HDPE for the moment, but if we can work to address some of those concerns over time, then it's certainly something we can add in at a later date.
Well, that leads me on to my last question before I go to my colleague Mark Ruskell. How, what would be the process for, in the future, adding more materials into DRS, like, for example, HDPE?
So it's certainly possible to include further materials at a later date. By and large, the infrastructure remains the same. You need to increase the capacity you have within the system to accommodate those materials. I would say the one exception is glass, because of the different considerations that are involved regarding the handling of glass and the infrastructure that's required both at the back end in terms of the counting, but also at the front end in terms of the retail return points, where different machines are required in order to accept glass where automated returns are.
So
intended.
that decision that you made to include glass, I mean, I think initially it was the plastic bottles and aluminium, and the glass was a decision that was made because it would be far more difficult to introduce glass and far more expensive to introduce glass at a later date. Was that part of the reasoning behind that?
So that's correct. I mean, the initial consultation sought views on a wide range of materials. I think what the Cabinet Secretary has stated is that actually the arguments in favour of the inclusion of PET, plastic and metal cans are quite clear. Glass was more finely balanced, we appreciate, because there are different considerations involved, but it is clear to us that if you were to delay including glass and seek to add it at a later point in time, then there would be significant operational and cost implications associated with that.
Right, okay. Mark?
What are the risks that producers just move to materials that are not covered by the scheme? So, you know, you mentioned HDPE or bioplastics, to just avoid the regulations by manufacturing using something else.
So, we've been keen when designing the scheme that we do not favour any particular material. That's been one of the underpinning principles for us. Of course, decisions taken by producers about packaging are ultimately a decision for individual producers, and we can't dictate that to them. I mean, what we can look at is the international experience, and there's not widespread evidence to suggest that DRS has resulted in material switching in the way that you might anticipate has been the case, for example. David, do you want to maybe just elaborate on that a touch?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Scott mentioned at the beginning that we're capturing 80% of the containers in scope. The other advantage, so what that effectively leaves out in terms of sealed containers is HDPE and beverage cartons. In terms of switching materials to avoid the deposit return scheme, we're confident that wouldn't happen for two reasons. One is that the beverage cartons can't house carbonated drinks, so you are limited in terms of what you can move to that material. And in terms of HDPE, the reason why a lot of materials are currently in glass or PET rather than HDPE is because there are other business drivers. So in terms of marketing, PET is clear, whereas HDPE, you don't get that sort of clear image. Glass carries that premium feel to it, where plastic doesn't. So there are clear business reasons that have driven the packaging decisions that have been made by businesses currently, and we don't think that the introduction of a deposit return scheme is going to introduce anything to influence that dynamic.
Finlay?
Thank you, Convener. Just before I move on to my topics, the level of deposit, you talked about iconic Scottish whisky, and so there's many different types of glass bottles out there that the branding is really important. Are you aware of any bottles that glass bottles which won't be suitable for use in the RVMs, and how will you include those in the scheme?
So we aren't, is the short answer. In terms of the reverse vending machines, the size that the typical machine would take is the size specified in the regulations, so between 50 mils and 3 litres. There was a problem previously, so the reason why glass wasn't introduced in a lot of the early deposit return schemes was that reverse vending machines up until about 7 or 8 years ago used to rely on spinning the container. And therefore, if you had a square bottle like a Johnny Walker whiskey bottle as an example, they couldn't be accepted by those machines because they wouldn't spin so that it could read the barcode. What has introduced over the last 5 or 6 years, almost universally by all of the manufacturers, is that it's now, rather than spinning the container, they spin the scanner. So there's a scanner that spins in the inside of the machine to make sure that we can take the full range of bottles on the market.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I want to look at the reasons for adopting a single uniform 20p charge on the deposits. Did the government consider a variable charge which would encourage the use of specific materials which maybe be easier recycled?
So we did ask a question or questions about deposit level through the public consultation, and the consultation seemed to signal support for a flat rate, which is what we've gone for. Of course, we have considered variable deposit levels and whether or not that would aid the effectiveness of the scheme. We have a concern actually that by introducing variable deposits, we would act to devalue certain containers in the eyes of the consumer or the public. And what we're keen to do through this scheme is to achieve maximum capture rates for all materials. So what we've identified is the minimum flat rate deposit that we think is essential to ensure consumer participation and effective performance of the scheme. It would feel slightly counterintuitive to go below that for certain materials, given the rationale that I've just described, and to go above it would introduce some additional cost that we believe is potentially unnecessary. So that's the sort of rationale for the flat rate deposit that we've adopted for the purposes of the regulations.
Elsewhere, we've seen a variable rate which would maybe address specific items. So, for example, in Norway, there's an additional charge or a deposit returned on energy drinks because they found that school children were tending to throw energy drinks cans away at the entrance to schools, and by increasing the deposit, that increased the number of cans that were returned. What flexibility is there in the future to have a variable deposit?
So I mean, the deposit will be set through regulation. There is obviously an opportunity at some point in the future to review the content of regulations. That's a matter for ministers and the Parliament to consider, but certainly we're of the view that for the purposes of introduction, the flat rate deposit makes most sense for the reasons I've outlined this morning. And it also does have the value of being easy to communicate to the public at a point at which we're looking to implement a fairly significant change in terms of our recycling landscape. We think it is important that we take an approach that is easy to communicate to the public, and it's easy for the public to participate.
Okay. What sort of assessment did you make of the risk of consumers upsizing? You can imagine if you've got small bottles that have a deposit of 20p compared to a large bottle, which is a deposit at 20%, you know, the ratio, a cost. So I'm concerned particularly around potentially consumers upsizing when it comes to alcohol or sugary drinks. What assessment did you make of the potential of upsizing?
So we have looked at that as part of the Business Regulatory Impact Assessment that was published back in July of this year. I think the conclusion that was drawn through that assessment was that whilst there was limited scope for upsizing, we did not think it was likely to be significant based on the evidence that had been gathered. I think the other thing that we're very mindful of is that the deposit is just that, it's a deposit, and we anticipate that 90% or more of deposits are going to be redeemed by consumers. And on that basis, we don't anticipate that actually the inclusion of a deposit is going to have a significant impact on consumer purchasing choices.
Yeah, just in you mentioned the 90%. On how have you assessed that the return would be 90%? What work have you done to make that assessment? It's a very high assessment when you look at other DRSs and initially how they started. How have you come to the figure of 90%?
Yeah. So we have based on the sort of Scottish Government's stated ambition to have a world-class deposit return scheme. So we have looked at what the best performing deposit return schemes are achieving. Predominantly, they mirror a lot of the characteristics that have been adopted in the proposed scheme for Scotland. So mainly the European schemes are return to retail with a deposit level similar to what's being proposed in the regulations and covering the range of materials. And on that basis, you start to look at the Norwegian scheme, Swedish, Denmark, Lithuania, Estonia. All of them are achieving around the 90% capture rate. In terms of the ramp up for that, the Lithuanian scheme is the most recent scheme that was introduced, and they actually achieved over 90% in year 2 after the scheme was introduced. So we think that the behaviour change driven by introducing the deposit and then making it as convenient as possible for the consumer by having all retailers involved in providing a return service will result in that rapid behaviour change, which will get us to the 90% very quickly.
Okay, and finally, what's the status of your discussions with the UK government around the VAT element of the deposit?
So we've written to the UK government, sent out the Scottish government's position in relation to this, which is that the deposit should not attract VAT, and we're awaiting a response from them.
Okay, when are you likely to get that response if you're looking to introduce this in April?
So we'll look to progress those conversations as quickly as possible, but obviously it's not in our gift to dictate when that response will be received, but we'll progress those conversations as quickly as we can.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. If I could explore the way retailers will engage and also look at the exemptions from the scheme. Could you explain to the committee what are the key benefits or trade-offs of requiring every retailer to act as a return point versus a system with a smaller number of centralised return points?
Yeah, okay, so we've undertaken fairly wide-ranging engagement on these proposals. Through the public consultation that we ran last year, we heard loud and clear that consumer convenience and accessibility was going to be critical to the success of this scheme. And in excess of 90% of respondents to the consultation called for a system that included some form of retailer participation in returns. So either return to retail solely or return to retail supplemented by depot. That would result in us having approximately 17,000 return points across Scotland, and it would have the effect of ensuring that it was as easy to return a container as it is to buy one, and we think that's really quite important from a consumer participation perspective. We've also looked internationally at how other schemes operate. There are a number of examples that return on a return to depot basis. David might want to talk in a wee bit more detail about those, but certainly what we've seen is that commonly they don't tend to achieve the same capture rates that we're looking to achieve for deposit return here in Scotland. There are a couple of exceptions where there are particular geographic factors which mean that return to depot works, but we don't think those are directly sort of translatable to the Scottish context. But I don't know, David, if there's anything further you'd like to add on that point.
No, I mean, I think that's the key factor, is that we have seen a depot model in the likes of Iceland or some of the northern Canadian states that achieve high capture rates. But you can understand without me describing why we don't think those are transferable to Scotland. I guess the other reflection I would have is that we have looked at what would happen if you exempted retailers based on a specific size, so somewhere in between that depot model and all retailers being involved. And what we found was trying to come up with some sort of accessibility criteria at a national level, resulted in there being black spots in terms of coverage quite rapidly by introducing some quite small size exemptions. And just echoing what Scott said, that principle about it being as simple to return a container as it is to buy one, that very quickly became not the case if we introduced any exemptions based on size or sales data or anything like that at a national level, which is the reason why the regulations talk about the potential for exemptions at a local level instead.
Okay, you've clearly looked at the international examples extensively. Have you estimated, for example, based on any of the international examples looked at, what proportion of retailers might seek an exemption from acting as a return point? And also, where small retailers apply for an exemption, they have to identify alternative local return points, when in fact the scheme administrator will already have done that. So could that particular regulation be changed to put the onus on the scheme administrator rather than the retailer?
So obviously the particular tests that we're looking to apply in relation to the exemptions for individual return points won't necessarily be directly, won't directly mirror, I suppose, the arrangements we have in other jurisdictions. So it's not quite the same as a sort of lift and lay in terms of our approach to retailer exemptions. But we are working actively with retailers through a retailer working group to understand how they would like to see exemptions work, and working with them on the design of those arrangements. In relation to the role of the scheme administrator, the regulations have been drafted so that they would allow ministers to award exemptions in the absence of an application from a retailer. So there is a scenario theoretically where we end up with a single scheme administrator who works with retailers across the country, identifies what the optimum network of return points looks like, and then comes to us, presents us with a list, and then we can make a judgment on that basis. The alternative is that it's open to individual retailers to come to us and submit an application setting out the steps they've taken to identify an alternative return point within reasonable proximity but has similar accessibility. So there are two routes that we can use there. In terms of whether or not the regulations could be adjusted so as to place this obligation directly onto a scheme administrator, there is no absolute requirement in the regulations that a scheme administrator be established. Instead, it's open to producers to take that step.
Okay, thanks. If I could move on to the situation where retailers accept returns manually, what arrangements do you anticipate will be needed to make sure materials are handled safely, particularly given that glass is now included?
So, again, as Scott's alluded to, what we are working with the retail working group to establish what the types of principles they would like to see. And what we have seen from international experience is there are two main key considerations for the range of materials that we've got. One is that glass needs to be kept separate from a weight perspective. So what we have seen elsewhere is you end up with a two-container solution. Almost universally, those containers have been bags, but you end up with a bag for plastic and cans, which are lightweight and don't pose very much of a manual handling issue, and a smaller bag for glass, both from a weight perspective, but also to make sure that the member of staff that's handling that is aware of what's contained in that bag and can see the containers. The regulations have been designed so that the member of staff taking those containers back can be confident that the container is in a good shape. It needs to be whole, needs to be identifiable as a scheme container. Once they have that, then the operations that we've seen elsewhere require the application of good practice, the same as the retailers will employ when they're unloading stock from vehicles, when they're loading those containers onto the shelf. So it's practices which should be familiar to staff, but what retailers have said to us is they want to make sure that the scheme is designed with all of this built in. So making sure that bags are appropriately sized, that they are there's a mechanism to seal those bags when they're full, that the bags are thick enough that if there are any damage to the containers, that it doesn't actually rip the bag or damage the container that those are being stored in. Those are all health and safety, manual handling issues that producers and the scheme administrator will have to manage in the scheme. And it's up to them to decide how to manage it, but what we are trying to do is communicate the good practice that we've seen elsewhere to make sure that where it's transferable is brought into that Scottish context.
Case.
Everyone aware we've only got 30 minutes left, so maybe we can keep our questions and our answers quite succinct.
Okay, with regard to the practicalities of requiring online sales to also apply the deposit and accept returns, where are you with that? What are the practicalities involved there?
Specifically in relation to take back? Yeah. So the starting point for this is that ministers don't want to see anyone unfairly penalised as a result of the introduction of deposit return. Now, we know that there are individuals in communities who can't always readily access physical retail premises, shops for whatever reason. It could be mobility as one factor, for example. It's important that those individuals can redeem their deposits in the same way that anyone else can, and that's really the underpinning principle for take-back, and ultimately it is those individuals who we expect will most routinely use the take-back service that's provided for through the regulations. There are other members of communities who will occasionally buy particular products online, but who the majority of the time will purchase their single-use drinks containers from the shops. And actually it'll make sense for them, it'll be most efficient and it'll be quickest for them if they return all their containers to physical retail premises. So actually we see online take-back being used primarily by those who rely on online grocery shopping. Now, the regulations have been drafted to afford a degree of flexibility to online retailers in terms of how they meet their obligations. So you could have a scenario where the online grocer accepts empties at the point at which they drop off the following week's weekly shop to the consumer. Alternatively, it would be open to an online retailer to contract a third party to provide that service on occasion where it's required, or we can even envisage circumstances where the scheme administrator would offer that service. And we want to allow or afford the flexibility to online retailers to meet that obligation in a way that meets their needs.
Okay, thank you.
Mark?
Can I just ask you briefly how you've structured the handling fees that go back to the retailers for administering the scheme? There does seem to be a disparity between the handling fees that are payable to the retailers and those working in the hospitality sector, for example.
Okay. So, sorry, just let me find the relevant section of the regulations. The main difference is that I think the handling fee in respect of hospitality services only covers the materials used for the purposes of collecting and storing. The rationale being that actually at the moment those hospitality businesses already deploy their staff to collect that material and to store it in preparation for it being taken away. So there's no additional cost to hospitality premises as a result of the introduction of DRS on that basis. The only additional cost to those premises would be the containers or materials that they require, which are specifically used for the purposes of the scheme. Is that anything to add, David?
No, so I was going to say, I guess the key thing to be aware of is that is just where they are managing materials that they would be managing otherwise. So if a hospitality premise chooses to act as a return point and take other containers, then they would get the handling fee for those other containers. They would be treated exactly the same way as any other return point. It's just exactly as Scott's just described. It's because they're managing that material anyway. If it's a closed loop on-site consumption premise, then there's no additional effort involved.
Thank you, Convener. Could I focus our minds on environmental objectives of the scheme in relation to the impact Scottish Government is aiming for on recycling rates and littering and also on greenhouse gas emissions, and how can the benefits be maximised?
Yeah, so in terms of the benefits that we see for Scotland, and the full business case stage 1 spelled out some of those benefits that you were describing. We're talking about 4 million tonnes of CO2 emissions being avoided over 25 years, over 160,000 tonnes of additional material being available for recycling, about there being real economic opportunities from that improved recycling quality. And in terms of the litter benefits that are available, in terms of most of the negative impacts associated with litter are actually volume related. There is the sort of visual impact of litter that causes the problem. And drinks container make up about 50% of the volume of the litter on our streets. So we think it will have a substantial contribution to litter prevention and the strategy towards a litter-free Scotland.
Right, thank you. And I've got 2 more questions, and I'll ask them both at once, and then whoever wishes to answer them can. One is particularly about infrastructure and transport arrangements for materials, and how can this be more sustainable? For instance, when some of us went to Norway, and we saw that that was bringing transport into the local economy, and that seemed very a very positive way forward. And my other question is in relation to the opportunities to increase the reprocessing capacity in Scotland in relation to the circular economy. And I see that you've highlighted there'll be a dedicated work stream in relation to the PET plastic. I'm also wondering about, is there any work stream looking at glass in view of the fact that, partly in view of the fact that there have been concerns expressed to me about manufacturers of glass who are already operating in Scotland, and what will happen about that?
Okay. Well, I'll
so
have
transport and reprocessing.
Yeah, transport and reprocessing. In terms of making the most efficient use of any infrastructure that's already out there, in terms of transport logistics and bulking points, the key thing to remember is that the scheme administrator that we expect to come into being is going to be interested in making this as efficient as possible, because what that does is keep costs down for producers. So having a producer-led scheme sort of bakes in that efficiency drive for the scheme administrator. What we are trying to do as part of our preparation to support that is to identify actually where there are existing either waste management sites or transport waste collection operators, parcel delivery companies that could offer the types of services that the scheme administrator is going to require. And we've been engaging them to understand what capacity they have, what infrastructure, what interest they would have. Now, fundamentally, it will be up to producers to decide whether they want to explore that. But especially in rural parts of Scotland, we think it will make the utmost financial sense to utilise that existing infrastructure. And if we can provide those contacts and have those potential suppliers thinking about how they could be involved, then essentially what that does is maximise the opportunity for that to be the case. For the reprocessing question, absolutely, the reprocessing work stream is looking at all of the materials and infrastructure out there, not just PET. We talk about PET reprocessing because this creates a unique opportunity in a Scottish context to aggregate the amount of material required to potentially attract inward investment in new infrastructure. And that's unique because at the moment that material is spread over such a large number of people that it's not viable. But that doesn't mean that we're not interested in looking at all of how we can maximise the use of that material, that economic value of that material. And I mentioned earlier, we are aware absolutely there's significant glass reprocessing capacity available in Scotland already. There is a demand for them to increase the recycled content that's coming in to the furnace, not just because from their perspective there are environmental drivers and their customers want that material to have increased recycled content, but also because there's business drivers for them as well. Using recycled glass uses about 20% less energy than virgin cullet being fed into the process. So there's a real drive there, and what we want to do is work with the glass industry to reassure them that actually the deposit return scheme will give them the quantity and quality of material they want to support that existing Scottish success story, which is our glass reprocessing capacity.
Thank you.
Right, we come on to questions from Mark Ruskell.
How do you see local authority recycling schemes changing as a result of DRS? And will it require an update of the household recycling charter as a result?
Yes, so clearly the material that will in future be captured through DRS does take up capacity within existing curbside recycling services. So there is a real opportunity going forward for us to review that and seek to explore opportunities for expansion, perhaps to cover different materials in future. So one of the things that we are committed to doing following the introduction, or in anticipation of the introduction of DRS, is to review the Household Recycling Charter Code of Practice. So some of that work has already commenced. I think the first meeting has now taken place regarding that update.
Okay. So, sorry, what does that actually look like on the ground? Is that more curbside sorting, or is it continuing with commingling of low-grade waste? Or?
So I don't think any conclusions have been drawn on on that just yet. We are keen to really understand what the capacity implications of DRS are, and then how best we can work with local authorities to take advantage of those. So no firm conclusions have been drawn on any of that at this point.
Okay, and how have the local authorities responded to the regulations that you've put forward?
Specifically in relation to the regulations, I've not heard a great deal of direct feedback in relation to them. Ginny, I don't know if any representations have been made in the course of any conversations you've been involved in. But
So no, just to confirm, we haven't had any direct feedback so far. Zero Waste Scotland?
We haven't. However, I can say that I'm at the COSLA conference in St Andrews on Thursday and Friday this week, so I fully expect local government colleagues will take the opportunity to ask me questions at that point.
Okay, so COSLA hasn't fed into this directly then? At this point.
So, I mean, what I would say is, so local government and the waste management industry, the private waste management industry, have been involved in the process. They've fed into the scheme design. Zero Waste Scotland have had at least 3 workshops and spoke to the Waste Managers Network on 2 separate occasions. As Scott's already indicated, the Code of Practice Household Recycling Charter is now being commissioned in terms of the review of that. And what that does is allow, so the actual DRS regulations don't place any obligations on local government, but what that does now, the regulations are in the public domain, is allow them to start to think about exactly the types of questions you've been asking, round about what does that mean in terms of how do I best use the capacity at the bin. And having been involved in delivering the curbside recycling service for Midlothian Council, and doing that type of review, one of the first questions we've got is how much material are we expecting to collect, and how many containers can our housing stock facilitate? So taking drinks containers, both the weight of glass but also the volume of PET and metal drinks cans out, opens up a whole range of opportunities that wouldn't exist with those materials being collected. And we expect local government to now start to probe what is the right solution in this brave new world.
So we wait and see with that. And just finally, you mentioned at the beginning of the session about the savings, the estimated savings to local authorities. That's predicated partly on landfill. I mean, a lot of local authorities are moving now to incinerating the waste, which has low economic value for recycling. I'm just wondering if you've taken that into account and how much agreement there is around this figure of 237 million savings. Is that something you've had feedback from local authorities on? Is that real and tangible?
So we have taken account of that factor in the modelling.
Right.
What we are doing, so I think what we've described up until now has been the steps we're taking at a national level to understand the impact on local government collectively. Alongside that, we are taking forward discussions, I think, with 30 of the 32 local authorities at the moment, and we hope to cover all 32. Just to understand what the practical implications are for their individual waste management services. So we've developed a tool that we've shared with each of those local authorities, and representatives from Zero Waste Scotland are going out and working with each local council to understand the implications and opportunities of DRS for their services.
Okay, thank you. Rachel Hamilton.
Morning. I've got 2 aspects to my questions today. One's about timing and implementation, and the other one's about cross-border implications. So I'll ask you 3 questions first, and then you can answer them all together on the first subject. Do you believe it's practical to expect producers to have their reporting systems in place to meet the compliance monitoring by April 2021? And can you share with us if the DRS Implementation Advisory Group believe that the timetable set out in the regulations is achievable? And in your answer, I would be really grateful if you could highlight the potential challenges of delivering DRS by 2021.
So we have, as you know, caveated the dates in the regulations because we want to have ongoing discussions with all parts of the supply chain about deliverability, and I would say right straight away that those discussions are still ongoing, so we haven't come to a conclusion about that, and there are various aspects that different parts of the supply chain are looking at. So producers have to look at lead times for packaging changes, and infrastructure retailers are looking at lead times for changing what they're doing in the stores, and wholesalers also have issues to look at as well. And we're at the and there may be external factors not to do with deposit return scheme that that parts of the supply chain want to raise with us too. So we haven't yet concluded all of that work, and I don't think I can say definitively that there's an answer on practicality of delivery. You'll be aware that different stakeholders have said publicly that they feel there are challenges, and that's part of our discussions are to understand the detail and the significance of some of those challenges a little bit. In a little bit more detail. We're working to a position so that will inform the final commencement dates before we start the affirmative procedure for the regulations.
Okay, and thanks, Ms Gardner. How long will it be until those conversations are concluded, and when will you be able to inform the committee of the retailers that you've still to speak to and the challenges that they are highlighting? When will the implementation group, I suppose, let us know those conclusions?
So we as I say, I mean, the last point will be at the point at which we lay the affirmative regulations, which we're expecting to be around the turn of the year, because that's the point at which we'll need to say, have a final date. There are several discussions going on with the Implementation Advisory Group between now and then, and actually the next one's tomorrow. So we're just continuing to have those conversations.
Okay, and do you anticipate that Zero Waste Scotland, as a delivery partner, will help with that implementation? Is that the expectation?
So Zero Waste Scotland is certainly supporting implementation, and David's already mentioned some of the investigations they're doing around infrastructure, for example, that will help move things on. We do have a European requirement that that requires 12 months, a set 12-month period between deciding on the scheme through the regulations and requiring businesses to implement those ones. So anything that we decide will have at least that 12-month period of preparation.
Could I just ask you just a bit more about that? So I know that some of your timings, I know your timings are caveated, but you have also looked at international examples and the delivery model that has happened in those circumstances. I suppose my question is, are you flexible? I mean, you're not stuck on April 2021. If there are significant challenges that are thrown at you, you are happy to consider putting that timing back. And actually, it lands in nicely into my second question, which is about, would you consider, because of some cross-border implications and perhaps fraud implications, that your timetable needs to be considered alongside or parallel to what the UK government are doing with their systems?
The first point, I would say the reason why they're caveated is because we are wanting to explore with the industry on what is achievable. But I think we need to understand a lot of the detail that sits under that in order for the Cabinet Secretary to make a final decision on implementation. In terms of the link-in with what's happening in England, I think you're aware that the Cabinet Secretary's made a decision that because of the climate change commitments, we can't afford to wait for a UK system to be decided on. So there are several steps still in the UK. They haven't yet fully decided there's going to be a deposit return scheme. They will require primary powers in order to have a deposit return scheme, so that will require primary legislation. And they're also intending to have a further consultation on proposals in 2020, leading to implementation in 2023.
Okay, so just to kind of wrap up the questioning, so I know we're short on time. What cross-border implications are there to be of the scheme in terms of fraud? And obviously, producers, I understand it's up to producers to implement or counter these fraud possibilities. Can you highlight what have been the challenges with some of the retailers speaking to you about this?
Yes, so the full business case stage one that was published back in May recognised potential for fraud in a scheme of this nature, and indeed some of the estimates that are included in that document are based on international experience around fraud. The regulations are, as you say, silent on the nature of fraud prevention mechanisms that are to be implemented by producers in order to mitigate the costs associated with that. What we've heard from producers is that certainly for the sort of larger volume lines that they produce, it is likely that they will head in the direction of distinct Scottish labelling for those products. But we were keen to ensure a degree of flexibility within the regulations to accommodate, for example, some of those more marginal lines where the risk of fraud did not justify, or the level of anticipated fraud did not justify a significant change in production processes as would be required to introduce a separate Scottish SKU. That applies to both large producers and their marginal lines, but also to smaller producers who, their space in the market is not as significant, and the costs associated with introducing labelling would be detrimental to them. So we've been keen to afford a degree of flexibility in terms of the approach that producers can take to this issue, and actually the judgment about the most effective fraud prevention measures will be taken by individual producers and any scheme administrator that is put in place.
Finn Carson, got a quick supplementary on that.
Yes, I suppose just to tie it up, I believe that the April 21 is more a political ambition rather than a realistic, practical ambition. Given that the UK government have intimated that their ambition is to bring forward a DRS before 2023, at which point do you look at the benefits of having a UK-wide scheme with regards to fraud, cross-border trading, talked about labelling, warehousing and whatever. At which point do you consider the benefits of waiting until there's a UK DRS scheme?
So I think perhaps that's a question best addressed to the Cabinet Secretary when she gives evidence. The government position, as we state it, is that that we should proceed as quickly as we can in Scotland with the deposit return scheme.
Okay. Will you have a calculation on the cost of introducing a DRS scheme in isolation compared to what it would be to bring in a UK scheme? Because that's obviously quite important. If there's going to be additional costs when it comes to fraud or cost to industry, there's bound to be a consideration that there's a limit to how much is sensible, the additional cost to bring it in early.
Let's be aware these are government officials, so some of the questions are for the Cabinet Secretary, but if you're comfortable answering that.
So in terms of the cost, the modelling that we've done through the full business case stage one and through the business regulatory impact assessment set out the costs associated with operating a distinct Scottish scheme and also the wider costs to business associated with participation in that scheme. So we have done the modelling on the basis that we have a Scottish scheme in the absence of a UK scheme.
Now, final questions from Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much. I want to just focus on the scheme administrator and how some of the detail of that, how that might work. And let me just start about how that's to be funded. In particular, it's estimated it will require an upfront capital investment of 28 million. And it's a private administrator. Who owns the private administrator? Because presumably it's going to have to be a limited liability company in some form. Who owns the shares in it?
So the corporate structure of any scheme administrator that's established is to be determined by its membership, I suppose. We have not set out a fixed view in terms of the corporate structure that's to be adopted. Our approach has been to place legal obligations directly onto producers and then allow producers to appoint an agent to act on their behalf in meeting their obligations. What the full business case does is suggest a model that we think could effectively deliver a deposit return scheme. We're using that to guide and inform discussions that we're having with industry, and indeed we're going to update that full business case in consultation with industry over the coming period. So perhaps a full business case stage 2 might more fully reflect some of the feedback we're receiving from industry about things like corporate structure and the funding arrangements for any entity that comes into being.
Well, let me then ask perhaps about some of the accounting, because the way in which it will be funded, it is said, is through unredeemed deposits and material value. Now, obviously, if you've got 90% recycling, you've 10% where the deposits are taken in but never paid out. At what point does that money transfer from the bucket that is the deposits that are going to be paid out into the unredeemed deposits, which the company can then use to fund its operation? Because clearly, I can see 10% of the deposits is actually likely to be quite a reasonable size sum. And I'm anxious to make sure that those who are involved in running the scheme administrator are not driving better cars than any of us in this room, for example.
So even if you end up with 90% capture rate which is the statutory target, what we anticipate is that if the scheme administrator chooses to use unredeemed deposits as a source of revenue and they generate revenue from materials, there's always going to be an outstanding balance. Yeah, so that additional sum of money will always have to come from the producers. So it's not in the producer's interests to pay any more to a scheme administrator than is absolutely necessary. So what we tend to see in other schemes is actually that these entities are operated on a not-for-profit basis, and that they are managed by producers themselves with retailer involvement, given their central role in the operation of the scheme. So if you create a framework which allows for a producer to choose to appoint a scheme administrator to act on their behalf, it's unlikely that they're going to pay significantly over what is absolutely necessary in order to receive that service from the scheme administrator.
But I'm just trying to see if the government might have a role in deciding when deposits are permanently unredeemed. Because I don't know how long it's thought it will be the gap between the 20 pence being handed over at the retailers and that 20 pence going back out to someone who's recycling. And it will presumably vary product to product. So it's kind of like when banks, Scottish banks in particular, issue banknotes, 5% of the banknotes vanish and are never seen again. And the Scottish banks can get the money back from the Bank of England. But not all of it, and not very quickly. This is the same concept. And I suppose I'm asking that question, but I'm also asking, if we draw too much out of the deposits, does that leave the liability still resting with the producers, even though the scheme administrator has spent money that they should not have spent?
So the liability would always ultimately fall back onto the producers, is my understanding of the way the regulations are drafted. In terms of identifying the point at which you can genuinely identify a deposit as being an unredeemed deposit, it's not a matter for ministers to determine, but there will be an audit requirement on the scheme administrator. So their auditors will require to see evidence which demonstrates actually that these deposits are genuinely unredeemed. Now, the full business case stage 1 sets out that it's likely that the scheme administrator will need to operate an observatory period. We've suggested that could be 5 years initially. That's a conservative estimate, and further work's to be done to establish what that observatory period needs to look like. Now, over that initial observatory period, it wouldn't be possible for the scheme administrator to utilise unredeemed deposits as a source of revenue. So instead, the operating costs would need to be met through sale of materials and any producer fee. But during that period, there is potential for the scheme administrator to accrue a significant cash balance, of course, because they would have all those unredeemed deposits sitting there. But until such times that their auditor has agreed that they are genuinely unredeemed and can be used to fund the system, they won't be able to use them for any other purpose.
So in essence, that's going to be held in escrow and drawn down in a formal way, and at least 5 years is the initial figure.
So we've included an estimate of 5 years. We believe that's a conservative estimate, but ultimately it's going to be a matter for the scheme administrator to satisfy their auditor about the unredeemed nature of deposits.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time. I want to thank all the officials for their time this morning. That concludes the committee's business in public today. Its next meeting on the 29th of October, the committee will hear from the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform on the UK's exit from the EU, as well as hearing evidence from Scottish Government officials on the Animals and Wildlife Penalties, Protections and Powers Bill. We'll now move into private session and ask that the public gallery be cleared as the public part of this meeting is now closed. Thank you.